Most of us think a concrete sidewalk is, entirely neutral. Doesn't care if you're wealthy, struggling, male, female. It's really just a slab of paved material.
Right, just infrastructure.
Exactly. But what if I told you that concrete was secretly designed to favor a very specific type of person and actively resist everyone else?
Oh, that's a wild thought.
It is.
Yeah, and the mission here is really to help you look at the buildings and the cities around you with completely new eyes. Because the architecture surrounding you isn't just background scenery, right? It's actively organizing power, memory, and, well, your own behavior.
I like to think of it like this. Think of an architect not just as a sculptor of concrete, but as the director of a play, where the physical set actually dictates who gets a speaking role and who is forced to wait in the wings.
That's a great way to frame it. And the source material fundamentally redefines what makes a good building. I mean, for a long time, it was just about aesthetics, like does it stand up? Does it keep the rain out? Does it look impressive?
Right, for the basics.
Exactly. But it's no longer just about standing up and looking persuasive. It's about understanding the complex systems, climate, gender, equity that a building just inevitably taps into.
So before we look at the whole planet, we need to look at the immediate spaces around you.
Right.
Because the source makes this bold claim that space is never neutral.
Right.
And I have to play devil's advocate here. Wait, isn't a sidewalk just a sidewalk?
Yeah.
How can concrete actually be biased?
Well, okay, let's unpack this, because it comes down to who we historically pictured using that sidewalk. For decades, mainstream architecture implicitly designed for an ideal user.
Okay, who was that?
According to the text, that user was almost exclusively male, able-bodied, economically normative, and completely unburdened by caregiving.
Ah, so like the classic 9-to-5 commuter. The guy who goes to the office, comes home, and doesn't have to worry about dropping kids off or grabbing groceries.
Yeah, and feminist architectural theory points out that spaces literally encode those assumptions. So everyday urban features lighting, public toilets, transit access, they favor that idealized commuter model and ignore the reality of care work.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Institutions like UN Habitat and UN Women are actually pushing for gender-responsive urban planning now because of this. If you look at travel patterns, the 9-to-5 commuter has a very direct route, right?
Point A to point B.
But caregivers, who are still disproportionately women, have what the UN calls polygonal travel.
Polygonal.
Yeah, like a web. They go from home to childcare, then maybe a part-time job, then the grocery store, then an elderly parent's house.
Oh, I see. Okay, so designing a city strictly for that 9-to-5 commuter is kind of like designing a smartphone interface exclusively for right-handed people, but on this massive citywide scale.
That's a perfect analogy.
Like, if you're pushing a stroller or working a night shift, the city physically resists you. Every transfer on the bus is a nightmare.
Exactly. And that's why this matters. It shifts architecture from this purely aesthetic exercise to an ethical one. Because if you build without theoretical awareness, you don't magically become apolitical.
You just, unconsciously reproduce the old biases.
You do. You pour concrete over the status quo.
Okay, so if the built environment isn't neutral regarding gender, it's definitely not neutral regarding race and class. And that realization leads us directly into what the source calls spatial justice.
Yes. And what's fascinating here is the text makes a really clear distinction between equality and equity.
Okay, break that down for us.
So equality is treating every space exactly the same. But equity recognizes that different groups face different historical barriers.
Yeah.
Architecture operates on land that is already deeply scarred by segregation, extraction, and prolonged disinvestment.
So you can't just treat a neighborhood that suffered decades of toxic runoff the exact same way you treat an affluent, historically protected suburb.
Right. And the AIA's guides for equitable practice frame this as requiring long-term institutional change, not just, symbolic gestures, which leads to some really uncomfortable questions about urban regeneration.
Oh, like gentrification.
Exactly. The source impartially points out a huge tension here. A beautifully designed public park might actually be an engine for displacement.
Wait, really? A park?
Yeah. Think about it. If it raises local land values without affordable housing protections, it pushes vulnerable communities out.
Oh, wow. I mean, think about your own neighborhood. Have you ever seen a brand new, gorgeous development go up and suddenly the local character just entirely disappears?
Yeah, happens all the time.
It's crazy to think that a building can be technically elegant, but completely spatially unjust. It looks like an improvement, But for the locals, it's an eviction notice.
And that's why architects can't claim ignorance of the economics their designs trigger. But, we've seen how beautifying a neighborhood can push vulnerable people out. Now we need to scale this up to, well, the ultimate displacement crisis.
The climate emergency.
Yes. And the numbers from UNT and the global ABC embedded in the text are just staggering. Buildings and construction account for roughly 1/3 of global energy demand and emissions.
1/3. That is massive.
It is. The era of modern architecture imagined design as a sort of mastery over the environment, right? Build a glass box in the desert and pump it full of AC.
Right, completely ignoring nature.
Exactly. But now, the IPCC stresses the absolute need for mitigation, adaptation, and circularity.
Okay, circularity. What does that actually mean for building? Are we just talking about recycling bins?
No, it's much deeper. It means designing with the end of the building's life in mind. So instead of pouring monolithic concrete that just becomes rubble, you use modular timber or bolted steel frames.
Oh, so you can literally take it apart like a giant Lego set 50 years later.
Yes. You reuse the materials without extracting new resources, but the text makes a crucial shift here, from general sustainability to climate justice.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because those are not the same thing.
Not at all. Climate impacts like floods, heat waves, they hit vulnerable, marginalized populations the hardest, right?
Because they have less infrastructure to fall back on.
Exactly. So the source argues that a net zero luxury development that accelerates exclusion is ethically incomplete.
It's like putting a diet label on a massive corporate oil spill. Achieving a net zero carbon rating on a billionaire's mega mansion doesn't actually solve the systemic problem. If the building materials are highly carbon intensive and the project displaces the local working class community.
That's a great way to look at it. Or think about seawalls. If you build massive concrete walls just to protect a wealthy enclave, it often pushes the flood risks directly downstream into poorer neighborhoods.
Oh, wow. So you're not fixing the problem.
Right, you merely redesign injustice. Climate is no longer just this optional green marketing layer. It's a total condition that changes how we view materials, urban density, and even whether we should demolish an old building in the first place.
Okay, so it's a human-centered worldview. The idea that we can just dominate nature got us into this planetary mess. The source suggests a radical philosophical pivot.
Yes, it really does.
What if architecture stopped revolving exclusively around humans?
Well, this raises an important question. We're currently in the Anthropocene, the era where human activity acts as a geological force. But the new theoretical frontier they discuss, particularly referencing Reba books working at the intersection, is the post-Anthropocene.
The post-Anthropocene, okay.
Or more than human design. It requires designing with animals, plants, soils, watersheds, and microbes as active participants in spatial life.
Wait. Architecture is literally shelter for humans. How do you design a building that decenters humans?
It doesn't mean ignoring human needs. It just means recognizing that human flourishing is totally dependent on ecological entanglement.
Okay, so what does that look like mechanically?
It redefines architectural elements. A river isn't a drainage problem to be paved over, it's a living system. And a facade, the outside wall of a building, isn't just a visual composition, it's a thermal membrane and an ecological interface.
Oh, my mind is completely blown. Imagine looking at the exterior wall of your office building and realizing it's not just a wall, it's a functioning habitat for local ecosystems. Architecture is shifting from dropping a static object into a passive world to actually designing dynamic living systems.
Exactly. It's a huge paradigm shift.
But with all these massive overlapping responsibilities, we're talking about gender, spatial equity, climate justice, and literally designing for the biosphere. What does the actual job of an architect look like today? Because it's kind of impossible for one person.
It's a lot, for sure. The role is definitely shifting away from the isolated auteur, the lone genius form maker, to more of a mediator, a translator, and a civic actor.
So they have to wear a lot of hats.
Definitely. Competence now demands rigorous ethical literacy and critical historical awareness, right alongside the technical skills. Architects have to know how a wall detail participates in global labor regimes and energy systems.
So they can't just draw a pretty line on a page and walk away.
No, not anymore. And pedagogy and criticism are shifting to reflect this. Schools are being pushed to teach colonial histories and climate literacy. And buildings are now critiqued on their carbon profiles and equity impacts, not just whether they look innovative.
So what does this all mean? Does this mean beauty in architecture is dead?
Not dead, no. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the bar has just been raised. Theory isn't some academic distraction from practice. Theory is exactly what equips an architect to handle realities they can no longer ignore. Without it, practice is just efficient repetition of the status quo.
So a building's beauty must now include its ecological and social responsibility. A stunning building that's ecologically devastating just fails the test of contemporary design.
Exactly right.
Wow. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. It really reminds us that architecture is so much more than building. It's the physical manifestation of our values. It organizes life, power, and possibility in space.
It really does.
And theory is the map that tells practice what kind of future it's building.
Hmm.
So tomorrow, when you walk into your office, your school, or your local transit station, look past the concrete and the glass.
Yeah, look closer.
Look for the invisible labor. Look at who the space was truly designed for and who it might be actively leaving out.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you navigate your city. Building on this idea that the built environment currently encodes inherited biases and shapes our reality, is it possible to design a deprogramming space?
Okay.
A building so radically reconceived that simply entering it actively unteaches our societal biases? A space that forces us to interact with the human and non-human world on entirely equal footing. What would that space actually feel like to walk through?